Everybody asks me this. How long is this going to last?
Putin thought the whole war was going to be over in 10 days.
His strategy at the moment is get to 2024.
I think the most likely use of a nuclear weapon would be a tactical one on advancing Ukrainian forces coming down into Crimea.
Hello, I'm Bill Browder. Welcome to the show where we delve into the mind of Vladimir Putin. In this series, I'll be speaking with people who know his story, who've lived the consequences of his actions, and who understand how he works. This is Inside Putin's Mind. I'm Bill Browder. Today, on Inside Putin's Mind, we're asking the question, what will Putin do next? The war in Ukraine looks set to reignite this spring. What will the Russian tactics look like? And how can Ukraine defend themselves? But first, let's take a look at how this war has gone so far.
The 24th of February 2022, a day no Ukrainian will forget in a hurry. The Russian offensive went straight for the capital. However, Russian forces encountered stubborn resistance around Kyiv, and their advance began to stall. A breakdown in communications caused queues of tanks along the road, and some senior Russian commanders were wiped out. In April, Russia hit back with a missile strike on a train station in Kramatorsk, killing at least 50 civilians. But the Ukrainians responded with a missile of their own, which sank the flagship of Russia's Black Sea fleet. By May, the last pocket of Ukrainian resistance in Mariupol was finally overcome after holding out for many weeks. In July, the last city in the eastern Luhansk region fell to the grinding Russian invasion. Ukraine turned their focus to defending Donetsk, where Russia had made little progress in its attempts to secure the second part of the Donbass. In September, Ukraine seized the initiative as it launched a rapid counter-offensive in the northeastern Kharkiv region, sending Russian units into retreat. The day before Putin's birthday, a large explosion tore through a bridge linking Russia and Crimea, which served as a major supply route for Moscow's forces fighting in Ukraine. 2 days later, Russia attacked Ukrainian towns and cities from land, sea and air, the start of a campaign to cripple the country's energy infrastructure. The Russian retreat continued into the winter, and they withdrew from the city of Kherson to the eastern side of the Dnipro River, a significant victory for Ukraine.
I'm now joined by Professor Anthony King, Chair of War Studies at Warwick University and author of Urban Warfare in the 21st Century. Welcome, Professor King.
Thanks for having me.
I think every single event, dinner, speech I go to, the first question people ask me is, how long is this war going to last? I'm not a military expert. I've got my views, but I'd love to hear from somebody who actually studies this as an academic. How long is this war going to last?
Well, depressingly, I think it's going to be a long time. I think the Ukrainians will try to make a counter-offensive this spring. I think it will be possibly partially successful, but I think we'll go into next winter with lines not massively different from where they are, maybe a bit different, maybe in Zaporizhia a bit different, and then we'll go into next year and there'll be another offensive, another series of attacks next spring. And I think at that point, both sides will start to be politically and militarily exhausted. So I would say we've got about 24 months before a plausible, peaceful settlement, a settlement which will be unhappy for both sides, frankly.
But what would force anybody on either side to make a settlement? So Putin, he can't show weakness to his own people, and a settlement is weakness. And the Ukrainians have been so pulverized, raped, mutilated, there's no appetite for any settlement there. My feeling is that this thing just keeps on going on and on and on because each side is just so entrenched. Is there even a chance of a settlement?
Well, when we say settlement, we're not talking some happy, peaceful accord. We're talking a settlement solved and resolved in blood, essentially. And my point would be that I think we'll reach a point of stalemate which may be ratified at a higher level or not ratified and descend into some standoff. But it'll be a simple matter of military and civilian exhaustion. The number of casualties, the amount of equipment that's been destroyed. I think you'll eventually get to a point where both sides accept the facts on the ground. And we can't be sure what the facts on the ground are. I think I think Ukrainians will probably take a bit more territory back over the next 12 months, but I am sceptical they'll take the whole country back, and I actually think that is a concern in some ways, in that if we get to a point where Russia loses Crimea or is threatened with the loss of Crimea, I think an escalatory situation is possible at that point.
So the other question at every cocktail party that everyone asks me is, will Putin press the nuclear button?
I think it's very unlikely. If you actually look at Russia, they've actually been quite restrained. They know how much the West and the US in particular supported the Ukrainians. Yeah, weaponry for sure. But the amount of intelligence support, which is now becoming quite evident and the Russians will have known about for some time, is very clear. And yet, what we see is the Russians consistently threatening escalation, including at the very far extreme nuclear escalation, but not going there. So I think the nuclear threat is a very distant prospect, but many of us didn't think Putin would invade Ukraine. So I would be deeply careful as we move towards the climactic point of this war. Say the climactic point is Ukrainian counteroffensive this year or next year is successful and Crimea is looking like it's going to be ceded back to Ukraine. You know, they're going to reintegrate their own sovereign territory. That is where I think questions, you know, serious political questions start to be raised.
So, as an expert on war, let's war game this out. If Putin were to use a tactical nuclear weapon on Ukraine, what would NATO, what would the West, what would Ukraine do? What would happen?
I think the most likely use of a nuclear weapon would be a tactical one on advancing Ukrainian forces coming down into Crimea, etc. I don't think there would be a military response in terms of nuclear military response. I think there would be massive increased support for Ukraine. Ukraine would have to then become part of NATO, etc., etc. But I do think that's the nuclear attack and its response is the furthest, most extreme option. I personally, although I remain utterly pessimistic about certain outcomes of the war, I still am sceptical that would be an outcome, because despite Putin's extremism, his radicalism, I think that he knows internationally that would be, it would put Russia, even with their allies, it would put them in an extraordinary situation.
So how do we reconcile the success that the Ukrainians have had with their deficiency in terms of equipment? I kind of want to predict that there's a continuation of this. 54% goes up to 75%, 85%, whatever. Or do they get lucky? How do we put that in our heads to be able to predict what's going to happen next?
Well, it's a great question. It's the absolute, really crucial, in terms of military operations, the military campaign, it's the crucial question. In terms of land warfare, one of the key dimensions of it, throughout all its phases, has been the heavy urbanized character of the warfare. And that explains some of the success that the Ukrainians have had. So in that first phase, 24th of February through to the beginning of April, the Battle of Kyiv, that kind of early phase, if we go back to then. The critical point is that the Russian forces totally underestimated the difficulty of fighting in and around urban spaces and the advantages that would give of a determined, skilled force to leverage off those urban spaces. They essentially thought, it's now public source, Putin thought the whole war was going to be over in 10 days. FSB agents were going to assassinate various leaders in Kyiv. They were going to assassinate Zelensky. The whole regime was going to collapse. It was going to be like Afghanistan, December 1979. It didn't happen. One of the reasons it didn't happen is that obviously politically there was support for President Zelensky, but then operationally that meant that the Russians were into a series of urbanized fights against skilled and very determined opponents. So Battle of Kyiv, they lost an appalling number of troops. They lost a whole airborne brigade, which their best forces around Hostomel airfield and attempting to get in to support them. And then there was a series of subsequent bloody urban engagements, Mariupol, Severodonetsk. They lost enormous numbers of troops around Kharkiv. They never got near to it, but they were treated very badly by artillery fires in and around the city. So what I'd suggest is the heavy urbanization of this war was totally underappreciated by the Russians and essentially meant they bled very badly for the first 6 months. And the result is that They've been trying to recover ever since. So what I'd suggest at one level, it's an operational answer. They underestimated the difficulty of attacking urbanised strong points. And the second point, which repeats the point I've made before, you combine that operational geometry with support from the US in terms of satellite, communications, targeting, and you have the result that you have now, which is a very bloodied, damaged force attempting to make a regain.
So do you think the Russians have learned from their mistakes and are now going to be better at what they were failing at before?
I think they've learned from some of their mistakes. And one of their mistakes in the first instance was the distribution and dispersion of force. They attacked on 4 axes. No axis had ever remotely enough troops to actually take the objectives which they wanted to take. And the one lesson that they've learned, or that has been forced upon them, is concentration of force. So if we look in that crescent around Sloviansk and down to Mariupol, 3/4 of the Russian troops are in that crescent, about 80 I'd say about 80,000, 90,000 troops in that theatre in the east. So there's been a necessary concentration of force. So that's lesson 1. Lesson 2 is that they are trying, not very successfully, but they seem to be trying to move to a more coordinated form of warfare. They've used electronic warfare a lot, but they're trying to move to a warfare that uses a combination of infantry, a lot of artillery, excessive amounts of artillery, electronic, and some air power. So I think there's a little bit of that learning there. And the other thing is they've gone very significantly onto the defensive. They've recognised the potency of the defence. They've built, since November, since the end of the kind of Kharkiv counteroffensive, they've spent a lot of time consolidating positions and going on to the defensive and exploiting the possibility of fortification and fortified positions.
So if you were whispering into the ear of President Biden, what would you tell him the Ukrainians need to decisively win this war?
I think the combination of heavier, denser force, tanks, armoured vehicles, long-range artillery, lots more artillery, combined with this architecture of targeting and helping in terms of planning, I think that's the optimal provision of support. And I think, some praise should be given to the US for providing that support and actually seeing early enough, because a lot of that support started from 2014, increasing engagements from the 2014 invasion of Donbass and Crimea. So I would say the US West should continue with those support. I think that also unfortunately tends towards a less than sort of climactic, extraordinary victory and more of a grinding process of reintegration of Ukrainian territory.
Well, I agree with you that this is going to be a long and heartbreaking war, and I'm very grateful for you sharing your insights. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
I'm now joined by Major General Chip Chapman. I've now interviewed an academic specialist on war. Now I'm talking to a warrior about Ukraine and about Russia. How do you think the Ukrainians are doing so far?
Well, the Ukrainians are doing amazingly well, but wars are fought for a better peace, and we're a long way from that better peace, both from the perspective of Russia and achieving their grand strategic objectives, and Ukraine achieving their objectives, and of course they're totally polarized in what those are. So from a Russian perspective, certainly from March last year, it was total victory and unconditional surrender from the Ukrainians. From a Ukrainian perspective, it is of course making sure that their sovereign territory, including the 4 oblasts which the Russians have illegally annexed so far, and Crimea, is returned to Ukrainian sovereignty and independence.
Where's your money?
Well, my money is on the Ukrainians, but for that to be true, it still means that they have to have the support of the West, and that must continue, because if they don't have both economic, humanitarian and military support, then they might well wither. If the West continues to support that, then the economic and industrial capacity of the West to support Ukraine will mean that they will absolutely overmatch Russia in every metric that you might look at. And indeed, one of the key ones in the last few weeks, in a way, was the American defense budget set at $875 billion. which is about half of the GDP of Russia. So if you bring that together with the West in itself, with a 40 trillion GDP against something like 1.6, 1.7 of the Russians, there is no comparison. But wars are not fought for geoeconomic reasons. You know, Putin is not a bookkeeper, he's not an accountant. He is there for power and extending his power, which is why one of his grand strategic objectives is taking over those spheres of influence and those parts of the former USSR that were lost in the end of the Cold War.
From what I know about Putin, and I'm not a military expert, but I know his psychology better than most, he will under no circumstances compromise in any way, shape, or form, because if he did do that, he would end up losing power, going to jail, and dying.
Yeah, and that is actually one of the ways, or one of the reasons that wars don't stop, because the decision makers and leaders fear those sorts of things and the loss of their power and power base. In terms of Putin's psychology, the thing I've always said he looks like to me is that he suffers from a thing called the hubris nemesis complex. This was something that the CIA first brought to the fore in 2004 to look at Milosevic and Saddam Hussein. And the thing about the hubris nemesis complex is they are not the type of guys that you can negotiate with. So I don't see a negotiation with him. But also we talk about the Clausewitzian trinity in war, when one of three pillars can fall to make you stop campaigning. So the first one, of course, is that elite defections around him. The decisive battle might be in the Kremlin, not on the battlefield. The second one is if the military stop fighting or have run out of combat power. There's been a history of mutinies in the Russian army over history. And the third one is if the population suddenly say, we don't accept this anymore. Now, that doesn't look likely at the moment, but if you have another mass mobilization of 500,000 people, there could be some sort of fractures, and there are potential centripetal forces in Russia breaking it apart, because there are 22 non-Russian republics within the Russian Federation. They are not ethnic Russians.
Is there anything that the West should be doing that isn't doing that would decisively change the outcome of this war?
Well, we must continue the information operations, because General Mattis, one of my old bosses, used to say that capturing the perceptions of the foreign audiences is the high ground of the future. He's partially correct. So maintaining the fact that this is an evil invasion by the Russians, which breaches every UN charter and every notion of independence and sovereignty, is something that we must continue to get out to the public. Otherwise, the sort of information operations from the Internet Research Agency and the trolls and the hackers, hecklers and honeypots of Russia will erode that will of the Western public.
Do you think that as time goes on, those voices to not support Ukraine will gain more traction? Is time on Putin's side and not on our side?
Well, Putin thinks it is. I mean, his strategy at the moment is get to 2024, when he thinks that the West will lose interest in this. Now, he's been wrong about everything so far. So we had the politics of fear with the nuclear rhetoric. We've had the politics of energy, I'll turn all the gas off, and now Germany imports nothing. And we've had the politics of hunger with the grain. So we'll maintain it, but you have to be on your guard, because one of the things under the old Gerasimov doctrine, and of course Gerasimov is now the leader, military leader, the fifth leader of the invasion, is that you hack people's minds. It's the force of politics rather than the politics of force. So we need to be on our guard, and there's no doubt there are certain decision makers in the West and certain major economic players who were compromised by Russian intelligence.
So, final question, and everybody asks me this: how long is this going to last?
You can't answer that, because there are scenarios, and there are multiple scenarios which are either a short war, medium war, or long war, depending on how things go. There are too many variables.
I'm going to put
the
you on the
most
spot.
complex activity, which is war.
I'll put you on the spot. What's the highest probability scenario?
The highest probability at the moment is that this will go on until at least 2024.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Joining me now is historian and Russia watcher Ian Garner. Ian, thanks so much for coming on the show. So you're a specialist in what's going on inside of Russia. Russian youth, Russian population. Is this war popular in Russia now?
It's extremely hard to ascertain real popularity in an authoritarian country like Russia, where opinion polls tend to be skewed towards telling the question asker what they want to hear and perhaps what the government wants to hear rather than what the respondent really thinks. But there are ways that we can gauge opinion through things like focus groups, through independent surveys, and in particular through social media activity monitoring that tell us a lot more about what's going on. And my suggestion is that although the rally round the flag effect from the early months of the war, when we saw a big wave of sort of patriotic excitement, especially from the nationalist right, that's waned a little bit over time, as usually happens during these sorts of wars. However, the Russian public broadly continues to back its government. We've seen peaks and troughs. Whenever big bad news breaks, for example, the mobilization last September, which got people worried, for sure, the popularity of the war dropped a little bit, but it bounced back relatively quickly. And right now, as Russia seems to be digging in and the spate of defeats that were happening in the fall have stopped, popularity remains with Putin and it remains with the pro-war effort.
You know, it's interesting, the number of dead Russian soldiers, depending on whose estimates you believe, is anywhere from sort of 3 to like 10 times what Russia, the number of troops lost in Russian troops lost in Afghanistan. Every one of those soldiers who's been killed in this current conflict has a mother, a father, sisters, brothers, aunts, friends. Is that not getting back to the people of Russia? Is there not an informal network of disappointment, anger, heartbreak that's sort of sweeping across the country?
Of course, there is individual and personal grief of mothers, families, brothers, siblings. But what we aren't seeing is that grief and those individuals have any real way to connect in communities and bond in communities with other people who are frustrated, as they actually did in the 1980s during the Soviet war in Afghanistan. And that was how the opposition to that war grew. What propaganda has done brilliantly coming from the Kremlin is seizing the narrative that grieving widows, grieving mothers are actually in support of the war and are aggrieved that so-called Ukrainian Nazis are killing their children, and that Putin is the one defending them, that these are regrettable sacrifices, but we understand we have to make them, otherwise more sons and more children will die. But of course, there is a completely topsy-turvy logic to this, because we know that the war could end tomorrow and all the killing could stop. But that propaganda narrative, that this is an existential battle, that if we don't fight them, they're coming for us, has proven to be extremely powerful.
So everybody is hoping that there's going to be some type of popular uprising, that people will finally say enough is enough. And I do agree with you that everything that we've seen so far would suggest that that's a very far-fetched scenario. But from your experience, what could lead to that scenario?
Let me answer a slightly different question, I apologize. Let's say magically overnight there is a will to do this, that hundreds of thousands of Russians wake up and decide, we no longer want this war, we no longer want Putin in charge, we want to change everything. What is the means for that to happen in a country like Russia, where the country has built an incredibly strong security apparatus that has something like 5 million, mostly men, employed, and that is an extremely large force. Think of the size of the uprising you would need to overcome it. And B, what is the narrative? What is the story that those people bond around? Because what the state has done brilliantly, in particular with the youngest generations, when we look past millennials into Gen Z and younger, is tell them this is the only way. The state has the truth that liberals, Democrats, queers, homosexuals, foreigners of all sorts are non-Russian, and they are out to get you. They're out to destroy you. And so when we have figures like Alexei Navalny, for example, who's putting out these, great and really powerful videos about corruption, where is somebody like him promising to take Russia? And how does a young Russian who is afraid that they might be denounced, that they might go to jail if they make an Instagram post about the war, and we've seen the state jailing those people, how are they supposed to go out and find a group of like-minded people to speak to, let alone protest with, let alone start a violent uprising with? It's going to be extremely hard to build that kind of community in Russia.
And my last question, if Putin were to go, let's say he just dies in his sleep, tonight has a stroke and dies, would anything change? What would happen to Russia tomorrow?
I think clearly there is no liberal white knight in terms of the leadership ready to step in. We're more likely to see a nationalist leader of some sort, or a group, an alliance of nationalist leaders come together, or potentially even scrap it out. But my real concern, and my real concern in the book that I'm about to publish, Z Generation, is in those young people who are being brought up with this mindset where they're told Russia is under threat, that they need to fight to save Russia, that Russia has a natural sphere of influence, that the West is aligned against Russia. And deprogramming that kind of mindset when they've been receiving that kind of ideological education for at least a decade, and right now it's accelerating in strength and seriousness, deprogramming that sort of stuff is going to take a huge effort, and there is really no sign from within Russia that anybody is willing to do it. That's going to have to come from us, from the outside.
Well, I'm very grateful for your insights. Thank you for joining the show, and let's hope that perhaps there is a liberal uprising somewhere that we just don't see yet.
Thanks for having me.
Now, where does this all leave us? We've heard from 3 highly authoritative sources on where this is all heading. And sadly, I think the answer is that as much as we want this war to end quickly, as much as we want the bloodshed to stop, it's not going to. Putin is not going to give up. He's not going to back down. He's not going to negotiate. And the Ukrainians, who have lost thousands and thousands of civilians, lost thousands of troops, have had hundreds of billions of dollars of damage inflicted on their country, are also not going to back down, and nor should they. And that leaves us in a situation where basically one of 2 things can happen. Either the Russians win or the Ukrainians win. My bet is that the Ukrainians win, but it's going to take a long time. And we've heard from very authoritative people here today who mirror that view. And sadly, that means we're in this for the long term. My thanks to all my guests, Professor Anthony King, Major General Chip Chapman, and Dr. Ian Garner. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the mind of Vladimir Putin.